Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us for another SMG's Are We Here Yet podcast. I've got two guests tonight with me in the virtual studio, and I hope you're going to enjoy. Um, I'm going to go right into their bios, and I'll let you, the listener, on this episode, decide what this episode is about. We're going to review the thoughts and ideas from a report that really resonated with me the other day. And my two guests are Stephen Posner and Kim Nolan. Stephen is originally from Baltimore, Maryland. He's lived in the Green Mountains of northern Vermont for 17 years. His work at the Garrison Institute integrates scientific inquiry with contemplative practice across traditions to build a more compassionate and resilient world. Stephen is responsible for leading the Pathways to Planetary Health initiative. His work aims to align systems with nature, internal systems of care and thought, and outer systems like economies and ecosystems. And Kim Nolan plays a number of roles in and out of UVM's graduate studies program here in Vermont. She works in helping to create engaged workplaces and learning environments that make a positive impact on the world. Community-based leader, educator, and consultant, Kim facilitates collaborative processes across teams, building safe relationships and achieving desired outcomes within larger systems. As a chaplain and coach, Kim works with individuals seeking transformative change and depth in insight and awareness. To both of you, thank you for joining us.
Yeah,
So,
pleased to be here. Thank you.
well, I'm really glad that you guys could make an episode. Your report, the core of your report, I'm going to put it into sort of my words a bit, and then I want you to sort of tell me if I've got it. It seems that it's advocating for a balance between our outer interactions with the marketplace of people, with ideas, and to first off find within ourselves the inner solutions or pathways first, right? Or bring the thought first to the table, sort of before externalizing with others. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that is a really important part of what we wrote about in that report. In terms of which comes first, it doesn't feel like it matters a great deal, or even that there needs to be a linear ordering of one and then the other, so much as both and matter. So that the integrating of the inner experience with the outer change-making efforts, and we explored why that's important by considering what happens when we don't integrate the inner and the outer, what happens when we focus just on the inner experience, what happens when we just focus on the outer experience, and then what happens when we integrate the two, and um, what are the benefits of integrating. So that's how we sort of structured that exploration. And Kim, it was such a blast writing it with you together. Our iterative back and forth process was really fluid and organic. And yeah, what would you say is, if you were to summarize it, how would you put it?
Yeah, I don't think I would change the summary. What I've been thinking about since our writing process and since it's been out in the world has been, it's almost an artificial highlight of the inner because we're just so not used to it. Our focus is so commonly on the exterior and the outer systems and strategies and actions, which are great, and I think where you and I pair up so naturally is like they're both important. Like I like the outer world stuff. I'm all about relative change and whatnot. So, bringing attention to this inner aspect, whether it's leading from the inside out or considering inner sustainability, um, might seem heightened because it's newer to the conversation or it's a reminder in the normal dialogue that we've been having these days. But without both, Scott, you mentioned that Stephen's from Baltimore, so am I. And so the reference, I always think like crab, like you start walking sideways. If you don't have both, you're not going forward.
I like it. I like it. Years
Yeah.
ago, I had a mentor gentleman's name is Peter Spellman, and in fact, he was on this podcast 4 years ago during the global health crisis. Peter and I talked a lot about, and I remember back when I was in school, this was definitely a theme for him. Just the idea that we're losing a lot of our it's not that we're losing the capability, the ability to contemplate, to be, of thoughtfulness, of mindfulness, right? And applying that. The reason why I earlier said first is, one would assume, you want to be intellectually rigorous and thoughtful and truly contemplate, a solution to a major problem. Maybe not even a problem, right? Just you want to walk forward having been contemplative, seeking first, right, before you bring your ideas to the rest of the world, right? And, one of the things we talked a lot about was just this idea that like we're filling our time up with things and people aren't giving themselves the opportunity of contemplative time, right? And restricting their use of their mind, their imagination even, right? The conversation started off around creativity because we're both musicians and we're both in music school, but it extends to every discipline that you might come into contact with in your life, right? It's just, mindfulness is not by subject, right?
It's in there. Yeah. I mean, for me, that's that's the root and the foundation of this inner life. And, you said something about like we haven't lost the skill to be contemplative. I actually would say our muscles have gotten weaker. It does take the time. Our capacity and potential for it, I think, is innate. I'm with you on that. But I think there's some strengthening we need to do in that skill set, that I think would be really important to add in. And where you're talking about rigor and whatnot, I always look at that as a three-legged situation of just like the reflective part, which is contemplative. I think scholarship and science does matter. And then the practitioner, like how we taken out into the world. So, all again, what Steve and I were saying earlier, like that the rolling around and needing that balance of all of it. But yes, contemplative time and the discipline, the practice is required to get those muscles warmed up, and strengthened.
Talk a little bit about the consequences that that's having for us. Apply that to whatever measure you wish to apply it to.
Oh, I mean, I think it's pretty simple stuff. And Stephen, I want to make sure you jump in of, the classic, you're reactive instead of responsive, just creating space allows, we can talk about it as the in-breath. And a lot of like my Buddhist chaplain friends would use that language. But spaciousness also allows our perspective to just take in more at the fast pace. That's driving at 65 miles an hour or biking at 15 miles an hour. You're going to take in more in all your senses. And so I think what's lost is, the fundamental potential for presence and that spaciousness and the clarity that can come from that. And then I don't think it's linear, but you can sequence out a few steps of spaciousness leading to clarity, leading to more centered communication. And ultimately, I write about that. Some of my scholarship is contemplative leadership, actually. And that, at some point, even in the midst of all the challenges we are facing, and they are scary. Like I told you, Scott, I was with students earlier tonight talking about eco-anxiety and climate trauma. And, giving them permission, there can be contagious joy in the midst of doing all this. And so, I think it's the difference of like me trying to lift something because I got these little wire arms and I don't have a lot of strength, bicep and tricep. That strains me. But if I work out, lifting is easy and I can move on to other positive experiences. I think it's somewhat similar. I
Yeah.
don't know, Stephen, what's your 2 cents on that?
Yeah, I think with the with returning to practicing and developing some of the capacities that I think can be deepened through contemplative practice. I think about like our capacity to listen deeply and not just with our ears, but with our hearts. to really listen and listen to understand, not listen to reply. And I think we do have a dulled edge there, a rusty skill set when it comes to listening sometimes, me included. By we, I mean I'm a part of it. I think about the capacity to stay poised in the face of grand challenges that are all around us these days. I mean, I can barely even keep up with the number of times I see the word crisis or emergency in headlines in reference to anything. It could be, I don't mean to diminish the urgency and intensity of some of the struggle right now, but I see crisis referred to for social ills and the homeless, people experiencing homelessness, drugs in society, climate change. A river was in crisis in the headlines the other day, right? Mother Nature. And how do we stay poised? Like, what's our capacity to remain uh, on a balanced footing amidst these challenges as they rear up in front of us? And in order to stay balanced, we have to first notice if we are or when we're not, right? And balance is a dynamic, ongoing thing, right? Just walking is an exercise in putting our center of gravity out of balance. And then we reach forward with a foot to catch ourselves and rebalance. And what about the capacity to just be here and have that be enough, right? To be here in our bodies, in a place on Earth. And Arowana Hayashi and her work, I think, really helps us remember that, yeah, well, our bodies are doing this or that, just sitting in a chair. Maybe our mind is somewhere else. And what's the body doing? Remembering to be in it.
It almost sounds like the idea, Wendell Berry's idea of taking pleasure in the work, taking pleasure in the challenge, taking pleasure in our existence, the good, the bad, and the otherwise, right? Many of us are living lives in the attempt to live in the absence of pain, as opposed to living a meaningful life, which would be to say you can find happiness, but happiness in a meaningful life is somewhat, I think, defined as a happiness that isn't necessarily happy, right? But that is satisfying, and where you can find a sort of deep and abiding pleasure in the work that you're doing. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm gonna jump in on this. I mean, that's why I use contagious joy. Joy is an innate capacity that can be reawakened. When you were talking, earlier before we jumped on the podcast of children and their a certain capacity, and not all children, but some of that innate capacity to kind of vibrate on that level in the universe. The scholarship shows us that happiness, although I love that word, hello, who doesn't want to get happy? Grew up with the Partridge Family. Come on,
Right
get
on.
it. But that there's conditions, and there we start engaging my preferences and my kimness and my ego. And joy can be rooted in something else. And that's why I add contagious to it, because then it's kind of transmitted and it's shared. And that's interesting to me.
Mm.
I've lost a little bit of interest in happiness. I want people happy, but I don't spend a lot of time talking about that. I'm really curious about joy. And I'm
Mm.
sure that word will get hijacked and need to be replaced by a different word at some point. But your Wendell Berry pointing the finger toward taking pleasure. I mean, I think innately that's what we're saying. That kind of how do we create reference points for that level of exchange in the universe and experience versus I got what I wanted, transaction complete. Um, a lot of the research, even with like lottery winning, like, yeah, oh, now I'm sad. Like
It's
it doesn't last.
it's a dopamine hit
Right. Yeah.
that
Like,
needs it's any form of consumerism. It's a dopamine hit, and then it quickly goes away, and you're left with, well, what next?
Yeah, and Kim, you're far more experienced than I with Zen Buddhism, but I'm heading to a Zen community later this week. I'm planning to go visit, and I'm thinking about no mud, no lotus, right? Or the the practices that help us feel the pain and release the pain and smile at the suffering and meet it with compassion, right? And recognizing that struggle in life is a part of life too. And we can have gratitude. That's another capacity that I think these days we would benefit from deepening and sharing and having a bit more contagious.
So it's funny because we spoke a moment ago about sort of, the avoidance of that. I feel like when we're not, because all of this, in part, tonight's conversation translates to, some major challenges that we're all, whether we believe it or not, or whether we think we are or not, we're all experiencing together, all of humanity. They're about as existential as it gets, right? With our climate and society working together or not. And so at the same time, we talk about avoidance actually in my mind keeps coming up. Like it's not just about the avoidance of pain, but the avoidance of really like accepting the challenge for what it is and not avoiding an internal conversation about it such that we then have some idea about how we might work together to solve some of the problems that we have, and then be able to have a discussion about that.
The acceptance of the major challenges for me brings to mind accountability and who and what we feel accountable to. And there is, I think, an acute lack of shared recognition of the ways we're all responsible to each other. And so I think the major challenges as we're avoiding kind of confronting them and sitting with them uh, and really confronting the deep underlying systems and mindsets and values that drive some of these challenges, we're avoiding responsibility and accountability in a way.
Why is that? In other words, is there there are specific reasons we can point to, or is it something that's more innate in us, just as much as there's wildly wonderful things that are innate in us as human beings? There's other things that maybe were good survival characteristics in the beginning, but aren't now, or why?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't have the answer, but I think of things like conscience, right? And and emotions like blame and shame that one might be feeling. And who wants to feel shame because they've contributed to some major challenge, right? Nobody really desires to feel those kinds of emotions. And so avoiding them is a way of it's a self-defense mechanism. It's a protective thing, right? It's so that like avoidance of accountability, I think is often driven by like a desire to protect oneself from harmful feelings in a way.
Mm, mm.
Kim, what do you think? Is that a
Yeah,
lot?
what's rolling through my head is like, the idea of like good old Darwin and survival of the fittest. I think it's like survival of the ego and anything that threatens that, some of that great work we know, like immunity to change, like, innately we are drawn toward our wholeness, and yet we screw that up. And I'm thinking of, the accountability part that you were saying. And my brain, in listening to you, Stephen, I went from like this framework I use often of like me, we, and it, and our connection to ourself, to one another, to systems or nature, and knowing, if you're able to make that the trip to the Zen monastery, you're going to get a good dose of teachings on inner being, and that just in my opinion, bolsters up the necessity to have accountability in the conversation. And that word that you were using opened up for me the idea of ethics, which ain't nobody in my circles talking about ethics these days. And I remember years ago, about 10 years ago, being part of a project where we designed an academy for contemplative and ethical leadership. And, at one point I'm looking at the curriculum and with some really high-end thought leaders as faculty, I'm like, oh no, we're not addressing ethics at all. And it's one of the necessities of mindfulness. Like that has to be the check and balance system. And I think that word got hijacked and we've put in responsibility and accountability, and maybe, they all commingle, but I wouldn't mind. The ethics of avoidance is a really important conversation. I don't know how the conversation would go, but it's certainly one I would want to be a part of. And I don't know if there's an end to the conversation, but the raising awareness process might be where the medicine sits. And we might end up making our same choices. And I don't know if I have a problem with that, but if we arrive at it more holistically, and I mean that in a complexity way and thoughtfully, that's cool. Great, you've done it with intention, and I'm down with that. I may not agree with you. That might be a wacky decision in my mind, but I know you got there with whole heart and mind. I can get behind that.
It kind of speaks a bit to an earlier part of our conversation offline, where, you have, there are things that are essential to us as human beings
Yeah.
that certainly would be, I hate this word, but they'd be wholesome for us, right? We
Yeah.
have the need and the desire to create. Many of us suppress that, not because we don't purely have the ability, but we suppress spending the time to do that. Talk about responsibility and accountability, but how can one really have a compass as to how that's supposed to go when we eliminate? This actually gets me thinking too about the various components of, let's just talk about education for a minute, right? The various components of curriculum over even just the last 30 or 40 years that in many different circles we've deemed, we just don't have the time for that anymore. In that sense, it should be like little wonder that we walk around saying, man, I just don't have the time. I don't have the time for that. I don't have the time to really figure this out. Whatever
Yeah, but that's
this.
code. That's code. So if I don't have time, that's just telling you in code that I don't prioritize it.
Mm,
All that's going on. I mean, I get Moore's law and time is moving fast. I get all that, but I think it's really just commentary on what my priority is.
right.
I it didn't mean to shortcut you on that, but I
No,
feel
no, you didn't at all. No. And anyways, please do. There's more things that a lot of folks might have not the time for, as opposed to, okay, well, what is your time for, right? Having a true definite, I'm talking about internally, right? I'm not judging others. I'm saying it's good to have a foundation of like, what am I going to prioritize? What's my plan in that regard, right? What fills me? What makes me whole?
I'd love to reflect on that idea of ethics and maybe let's think about education. I like that as an example. And in education and the way it's practiced, I'd say in this country, in the US where I live, it's very untethered from ethics in a lot of ways. There aren't a lot of ongoing conversations about why or what for within the ways, our school budget is going to be voted on tomorrow here in Heinsberg, right? This the second time, and there's a lot of tension in the town, but those deeper questions about why we have the buildings the way they are that house our young people day in, day out, right? Most of their time spent inside of buildings that are unhealthy and maybe toxic in some cases, right? The materials used to construct the buildings, and what for with the ways things are taught, the compartmentalization of different topics in education, the sort of like extraction of young people from the community and from the society in which they live in order to go to school, right? And that's where education happens. And the ethics is so critical. I would love to be a part of the conversation you convene, Kim. So just let me know when and where, and I'll be there. But I'm thinking about how important it is with contemplative practice. I was just in a conversation the other day with someone who's written dozens of books on mindfulness and the benefits to human health and the importance of mindfulness. And they said that there's great risk in people becoming more calm in their individualistic, ego-driven pursuits, right? So without an ethical dimension, even just contemplative practice and mindfulness practice, what for and why, right? If it is steered towards becoming even more effective at driving for separation of people from the land or from each other, from themselves. And yeah, we need to be slowing down and engaging in those ongoing ethical explorations, I think.
There's perhaps the biggest challenge that we might talk about tonight, and that being what you're describing suggests, it's not having, there is no silver bullet, if you will, right? We need to encapsulate ourselves into all of these things, right? We need to be connected to the soil. We need ethics, all of these things, but all of these things seem to have the same strain that I'm hearing is that they help us to recognize the humanity in each other. They connect us.
Yeah, I think that's the inner being part, but I also think it invites us into embodying some of what we're talking about, like getting it to be the whole system and having our own direct experiences that we then, I mean, now we're back to vibrations, right? From the jazz talk pre-recording, like when you're embodying that level of compassion and wisdom, something's happening. And I may not have the skills to articulate it, but when you're around that. And that, I think, there's explicit different kinds of motivation, intrinsic, explicit, all those. And then this is a whole nother level. And so I think, and again, to the original point, like building the skills and the muscles to be able to go into these things just starts unearthing perspectives that then naturally that aha, which in my world usually has more of a sound of no duh, because it's right there. Like, how did I miss that? Ugh. So I don't know if I'm going off track a little bit, but I just, there was something in what you said, like this notion of embodying it, I think is really important. And not just in a walk your talk, like I recycle because I care about the planet. I don't mean that kind of alignment. I mean deeper in our core, an embodiment of these.
And how all these things connect one to the other, how it
Yeah.
orchestrates, right?
Yeah.
To use another musical term. So guys, we want to round this out, so to speak, for our episode and talk about how we apply a lot of this great, great stuff that we've talked about over this last little while. So, Stephen, perhaps you can sort of lead the way there on some examples where we're applying concepts that we've discussed.
Yeah, one area that I've been working on for maybe 7 or 8 years now is called natural capital accounting. And this draws from all of the work that happens to account for things, right? Things of value. By accounting, we're measuring, we're ascribing value. And so we're kind of, in a way, like determining to some degree the value of things within particular systems. In the economy, we account for things in governments all the time. Everybody may be familiar with GDP, gross domestic product. That's one big example of how we account for things. We're literally measuring expenditures and flows of resources through an economy, government investment, personal expenditures, net imports and exports, and we're counting and we're ascribing value. There is a whole system of national accounts that GDP is a part of. And this system does not do a very good job accounting for nature and natural capital and all of the ways in which nature provides benefits to humans, measurable benefits. And so we've gotten a lot better at measuring these things. We've gotten a lot better at accounting for the flows. And the United Nations has a system of integrated environmental and economic accounts. The United States now has an initiative to account for natural capital. The Department of Commerce is one of the places that's applying this work, but it's really across all the agencies. And so for many years, I've been a part of an interagency group, Department of Agriculture, Interior, and beyond. And it gets in the weeds a little bit. So there are statistical agencies that are a part of the US government where some of these data are sort of tracked and managed. But what's really exciting beyond the in the weeds technical work is that it's really a shift in mindset. And natural capital accounting is an opportunity to not just do the numbers and not just count things differently, but to really perceive things differently and to not separate the economy and the ecosphere as these two distinct things where we can draw resources out of the ecosphere and then put waste back into it, but really to embed them within each other and to see them as one and the same in a lot of ways.
It's kind of interesting to think about by doing this and putting all of our natural assets, if you will, out on the table in front of us at the same time that we're talking about our other more traditional measurables in the economy, that it really forces the issue to see, right, the real value in it, and to have to account for the way you just described it, the way that we extract and then make waste has consequences on that environment. But unless we actually are accounting for it in our initial conversation, it's not even a part of our thought process. It's just something that happens afterwards. It's not part of the accounting.
That's right. That's right. It's sort of invisible, right? It's essentially given a value of 0. And this happens in very human ways too, right? Human capital is often overlooked. We don't account for the unpaid household work that happens every day. We don't
Mhm.
account for the stay-at-home parents who are caring for young people or elderly people. We totally miss that. So the economy misses these things. And in the natural capital accounting world, we've applied pretty vetted and well-developed methods to the southeastern United States to understand the flow of services from the natural environment to economies. We've applied it across the entire US when we've accounted for water. We've created a water account to understand groundwater and freshwater flows and how there are demands and how it is produced. So it's really a growing area, and we just had this paper come out a few weeks ago that I can share with you, Scott, and maybe we can put it into the website for the podcast later.
Cool. Please do.
You make me think about, I come back in my mind to Simba, the MBA program here at UVM, and you make me think about the research and methodologies and how we're so quant driven, number this, number that, number this, number that, and trying to expand that to include at least mixed methodology in research and bring in the quantitative lived experience. So just fundamentally, you're doing some application in the work that you're doing. But that's it. There's a very simplistic frame I use of head, heart, and hand. It's not really complex, head and ideas, capacity to learn, knowledge acquisition, heart, your passion, what are we talking about? Where are you putting your attention? And then the hand of application and being able to apply. Numbers matter. I don't mean to dismiss that, but I want to bring balance by the story, the narrative, the lived experience. And maybe old measure, the yardstick doesn't capture the measurement of that. So instead of dismissing it, my argument is, why don't we get a couple new yardsticks and they're all real good and kind of make room for everybody, which gets into, yeah, go ahead, Scott.
No, I was going to say, it feels like what you're describing is a way to express sort of a return back to the original definition of political economy, right? Not political partisan parties, Congress, political, like, unless that title to me seems to say, you take economic data, right? And then you humanize it. I mean, unless you apply it to society, to communities, to neighborhoods, to thought process, it doesn't have any value, right? Because the original way to describe an economist in the 19th century was, he or she works in political economy, right? That this information is supposed to benefit people. The other thought I had as you're talking, Kim, is like it gets very quickly into this parallel equivalent. I don't know how you want to describe it, but measuring things differently. Like our court system, our entire legal system is set up to define, to protect, right? But all of this happens in the human world, And there are some people trying to pioneer, as an example, the rights of every other living creature or every living thing on the planet, right? So if the environment has some kind of measurable value outside of just something that we extract, surely it has rights to exist, right?
Yeah,
And not just at the behest of humans.
yeah, yeah. No, there's something I think important and not a typical, at graduation, I also often talk about it's not usual that you get to use the word love and business together, but I do, which not everyone loves. And the idea of like making the invisible visible. And to me, that's part of the application process.
Mm.
Whether it's visible by measured normal quantitative methodologies or measurable that in the long run or in our immediate gratification ADHD society right now and immediate. So, application, which is critical to all of these concepts and points of merger, also has a little work to be done to expand so it's more inclusive.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And I think room to expand to be a little less anthropocentric as well, right? To make room for the rest of nature of which humans are a part. And when you were just describing that the rights of nature piece, that's another really active area, right? There are nations like Ecuador which have in their constitutions inalienable rights of nature. And then in the US, there are many different states which have begun to enshrine in their state laws and constitutions human rights to a clean and healthy environment. And these are kind of different sides of the same thing, right? Nature has rights and people have rights for nature or for access to nature. And I think what some of these conversations around the rights miss are like the obligations or the responsibilities, the shared responsibility to care for each other and ourselves and the rest of creation as we're able to. The shared responsibility to the commons and to to nature. We're in it together.
Mm. It is about, isn't it ultimately really about our survival? I mean, if, when we say we're going to save the trees, if we go, we're really saving ourselves. We'll go extinct because we're at the apex of the food chain, if you will. The trees will be here after us. In fact, they'll probably do better to some extent, certain species, right? If we were to not be here, but this, it's about creating a better balance so that, we all get to be here and get to survive.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm gonna go out there just for 1 sec and we'll come back to applications. But this is making me think of there was a cabinet member in the Reagan administration who was famously, I think, misquoted, but the sort of like content of the things that he described were along the same lines as when we cut down the last tree, it'll be okay because then the Messiah will return. And that is such a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yes, I agree. If we cut down every single tree, then we can expect for, the end of days or things to stop working on this planet the way they have worked for a long time. And the survival piece for me is baffling, and I don't know what to make of it, but it's almost like we are so good at surviving as a species. If you look ecologically at different species and you have human beings, we are so good at surviving. I mean, look at the range of our species across habitats, temperature, location, arable soil, water or not. Like we can live all over the place, deep in the ocean, up in space. And it's almost like our survival is now threatened by our drive for survival in a way.
Wow.
Like our dominance of nature and our our like constant pursuit of survival and perceived threat of extinction is in a way a threat
What
of
level of unconsciousness do you need to achieve as an individual writ large over millions of people to get to that point?
It's a good question.
Yeah. You know, you're bringing, I don't know the physics, the universal law, like where systems don't, like energy can't leave a system, it just changes form.
Thermodynamics, yeah.
Yeah, and
Yep.
you're bringing that to like survival. I don't know what survival, what that actually, the forms are going to change, and they do, and things go extinct, and forms alter all the time. So, you know, like our extinction or our survival is our firm grip on wanting it to stay the same. And then we forget some of those perennial philosophies of interconnection. You know, when you were talking, Scott, about like the trees, and we are the trees. We're all connected. The sun, the rain, the moon, like that's us. It's all the
Right.
same. And so until I look at it as like, where is your gaze down your nose and you only see yourself? Is it out at an angle? Is it at the horizon? Like, where are you looking and what are you including?
Yeah.
And then what are the ethics, or you were saying earlier, the responsibility to that? And having that base and values and stance, and you know, Stephen, you were talking about values before, that has to be intact as an anchor if you're going to go out and apply. You know, again, I'll talk about our students come to Simba, their application essays are gorgeous. I save some and give them back at graduation of just like, I'm so glad you've been with us. And they, you know, of course, they're motivated to change the world, systems, this, that, and the other. And I can't tell you how many people upon graduation, when it gets time to apply their knowledge, they've gone through the rigorous academics, they've gone through an experience with the practicum, and now they're going to enter the world again. And they are hell-bent on high figure salaries, and maybe they'll work a couple years in a corp and get back to changing the world. Like that gaze
Here it
comes
is.
down. Yeah, I got a student loan. Absolutely, no argument there. I have a family. No argument there. So, you know, the application has to be intimately mingled with the ethics and the passion, or else we get amnesia really quickly. An individual, at least I think in our US centric perspective, taking a US centric perspective on our world, we get back to the me and we forget the we and the it really swiftly. And so, you know, taking this out with us into creating change. And, you know, I'm using Simba as an example. I can talk about for years the work I did of the care provider, like those that are out doing the hard work, the chaplains, the educators, the healthcare providers, the social workers, and how to, you know, sustain that inner well-being and reservoir of energy so they can further help others. But to do that work, if you don't have the ethics mixed in there, it just becomes this really weird tail chasing game versus having a clarity. You know those really wise people. I want to say elders, but it's not just subject to elders. There's people who are well processed that have that clarity of like, you know, I'll go out there and create change. You might not know my name. My ego might not be fulfilled, but in my little world, I've made a teeny little dent. And by doing that, because I'm interconnected to the dent, I've made a change in myself. So I don't know, that might sound a little soapboxy, but I
Yeah.
think those components in the application conversation are critical, and I just wanted to highlight them.
It seems to me you guys have, through your examples of application, have perfectly brought us completely around full circle to why we started to connect, the three of us, in the first place. And that is over the conversation of your report, of the recognition of complex adaptive systems. When we separate, when we silo, when we specialize without bringing it all back together, we can create all kinds of rationales for some really detrimental behavior that, when we think about it on the whole, we're like, oh yeah, that's crazy. Why would people do that? Right? Why would we hurt ourselves that way? Why would we degrade our environment to the point of making a place unlivable for ourselves and for others? Right? But when we silo things, we can create all kinds of rationalities based on a very narrow perspective. And you guys have just, in a far better and more articulate way, and in multiple examples, have brought us back to that. Like, you know, there's a point at which we separate things so we can understand the individual parts better. but then we need to put them all back together and see this as the ecosystem that it is.
Yeah, I agree. And one other area of application that I think really resonates with what you were just saying, Scott, is food systems and food, right? I can hold all of these inconsistencies in my mind on a daily basis that I am a part of that that are based on what you were describing, the separation of things, the sort of narrow view that we can, within the narrow view, rationalize things, but in the broader sense, be doing things that are very problematic and that might compromise the ability of future generations to live healthy and well lives. Um, in a food system, I can have a full belly, but be terribly malnourished and have no balance across nutrients, right? And I can also have a full belly and be completely disregarding the source of the food and the farming and the farmers that went into it and the sunlight and the rainwater and the soil, etc., from which it came. I can have a full belly and compartmentalize that from any of these other areas of a food system, which I think are also really important to consider. And so we do have these food systems that feed people and also malnourish people and malnourish the land. And so there's a group that we've been partnering with a little bit lately. They're part of the United Nations. They're in the development program. So it's a group that doesn't operate a great deal in the US. While the US provides a lot of development assistance to other countries around the world, UNDP mostly operates in other places where there's high need for that development assistance and aid and support. And in the food and agriculture part of UNDP, there is a Conscious Food Systems Alliance that's been convened. Conscious is an interesting term and people may have certain reactions to it, but really what it's talking about is helping cultivate food systems that are responsive and based in awareness of these broader issues that we're talking about, that aren't focused in the narrow way that can lead to all of these problems. And what I really find very compelling and inspiring about the work with this group, they're really focused on systematically growing inner capacities to address food system challenges. Things like capacity to collaborate, capacity to listen to one another and to communicate in times of stress or great urgency. And you can imagine UNDP is operating in some pretty high conflict places. And so having these inner capacities is really important to help make sure that the food systems are operating, that flows of nutrition and nutrients are reaching the people who need them. And so we're thinking about applying some of the conscious food systems practices and capacity building work here in the US, in the Northeast. And I'll just leave that as a little teaser. I won't say anything else about it now unless you have questions.
Nice. It's another podcast in the making. Really is right there. Kim Nolan, Steve Posner, I can't thank you enough. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I look forward to more conversations in the near future too.
Sounds great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.